1. Ted Bundy. From good looks and charm, Ted Bundy basically had it all on the surface. A mask that literally hid one of the most insane serial killers of our time. No, like for real. This guy could have been a model with those all-American boy-next-door looks. You see, Bundy's whole shtick revolved around utilizing that superficial charm and attractiveness to lull his prey into a false sense of security. He'd employ acts like faking injury or pretending to be an authority figure to gain young women's trust and isolate them. But then, when his victims were alone and vulnerable, the real Ted Bundy would emerge like a demon from the shadows, a psychopathic monster who would bludgeon them, sexually assault them, sometimes even decapitating them to indulge in pretty sick acts, their lifeless bodies, as the dude went full-on Hannibal Lecter. The worst part is how meticulously ritualistic Bundy's operation became. He treated victims' severed heads like trophies, having sex with their decapitated corpses and even applying makeup to their dead faces and trying to reanimate them for his fantasies. Maybe he was trying to put together his own creepy harem of living dead dolls? We'll never know. For years in the 1970s, Bundy carried out this monstrous cycle of homicidal violence and sex fantasies, all while flashing those pearly whites, luring, killing, desecrating, burying, or disposing of what's estimated at over 30 victims minimum, though the true number may never be known for sure. When finally apprehended in 1978, after a frenzied rampage, Bundy's forced charisma kicked into high gear. On trial, he tried putting on that manipulative charm offensive as an attempt to undermine the overwhelming evidence against him. You can almost picture him giving a cheesy wink to the courthouse ladies between gobbling human remains. 2. Jeffrey Dahmer. Now, this unassuming-looking dude from Milwaukee was harboring some of the absolutely sickest urges of a serial murder. On the surface, Dahmer seemed like a total mundane milquetoast, a gawky, bespectacled, cute little muffin man. But if ever looks could lie, beneath that dopey exterior was one of the most deranged, disturbed minds imaginable. Dahmer's whole move revolved around luring guys from gay bars and bathhouses back to his apartment. Once there, he'd get them impaired on drugs or booze before unleashing his true nature, bludgeoning them, drilling into their skulls, dismembering them. Dahmer took things to a whole other level of mania. He kept tons of grisly souvenirs, skulls, preserved body parts, the usual treasures from deranged psycho hoarders. There were even reports of the guy literally eating portions of his victims and practicing necrophilia. For over a decade, Dahmer indulged his murderous cravings in such insane ways, eventually racking up a body count of 17 confirmed victims before finally getting busted in 1991. So what happened was that, in July 1991, one of Dahmer's intended victims managed to escape his apartment of horrors and alerted authorities. When police investigated, they were understandably traumatized by the grisly discovery: severed heads in the refrigerator, dismembered cadavers, and human remains being preserved in vats of acid. Dahmer didn't even attempt to mask his guilt, calmly describing in extreme detail his ritualistic killing methods, obsession with turning his victims into zombies by drilling into their skulls, and even admitting to acts of cannibalism and necrophilia. In February 1992, Dahmer received his punishment: 15 consecutive life sentences in prison, with a 16th life sentence added in May for another earlier murder charge. Just 2 years into his life sentences, Dahmer unsurprisingly met a brutal end in November 1994. During a prison work detail, he and another inmate were bludgeoned by a fellow prisoner with a metal bar used to unbolt prison tables. His head was crushed beyond recognition, a pretty crazy death oddly befitting someone who routinely dismembered skulls. Rest in piss, lil bro. 3. Aileen Wuornos seemed like a hard-luck case straight out of the trailer parks of Florida. A prostitute with a horribly traumatic upbringing full of abuse and abandonment issues. The kind of tragic backstory that'd turn even the most stable person into an emotional tornado. But Aileen? Well, she took that pain and turned it into an incredibly warped, rageful killing spree of any man who wronged her in even the slightest way. At least, that was her professed justification. Between 1989 to 1990, Wuornos went on one of the most bizarre, hot-blooded killing sprees imaginable. She straight up executed 7 different men, many of them truck drivers or working stiffs, by shooting them at point-blank range with her trusty .22 caliber handgun. No muss, no fuss, just bang, you're dead. What made her MO especially weird was the almost effortless, cold-blooded nature of her murders. By her own admissions, several happened in self-defense after facing assaults or rape attempts. But others... Wuornos straight up admitted she just didn't like how they looked before putting bullets in their skulls. Well, that's one way to go: death by prostitute. For months, Wuornos managed to evade the law, living like a drifter on the run, funded by her victims' cash, and robbing more men along the way to maintain her sex work outside the box lifestyle. She basically thought of herself as a sort of vigilante sticking it to the system. Eventually, that .22 caliber calling card caught up to her in early 1991, after an old lover helped rat her out to the cops. What followed was an absolute media circus of a trial straight out of the hot, humid Florida swamps she crawled from. Despite her legal team's efforts to argue insanity and self-defense against the string of murdered men, Wuornos was convicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. In the final hours, Wuornos stuck to her familiar brash demeanor. She declined a last meal, opting instead for a single cup of coffee. When asked for any last words, she snarked back defiantly, "I'll be back, like Independence Day with an army of others." 4. Ed Gein. You've probably never heard of him, but you probably have heard of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This was literally the guy who inspired the whole thing. On the surface, good old Ed seemed like a harmless, eccentric loner, content to live out his days in that ugly homestead he inherited from dear old mom. Little did his neighbors realize the unspeakable horrors festering just a few feet away. You see, Gein's whole modus operandi was fueled by an obsession with his long-dead mother. After she passed, Ed's grip on reality kind of fully slipped into a nightmarish realm of grave robbery, cannibalism, and crafting literal totems from human skin and body parts. The psycho would straight up raid fresh graves for newly buried middle-aged ladies who reminded him of Mommy Dearest. He'd crack those coffins like a kid tearing into their favorite Kinder Joy, harvesting body parts to fashion into keepsakes and flair for his home. We're talking full-on Ed Gein deluxe skin suit couture, shrunken skull bowls, human skin coverings for chairs, a leathery bust complete with a woman's real hair. Dude even tried cooking a weird body stew with some of the remains at one point. For years, Gein carried out his deranged body-snatching spree under everyone's obliviously quaint Mayberry radar. Only after facing arrest in 1957 on a petty charge did his full-blown Silence of the Lambs meets the Texas Chainsaw Massacre operation come to light. And the craziest part? During interrogations, Gein played it all off like he was just trying to become his own idea of mom reincarnate through these insane totems. Initial psychological evaluations portrayed Gein as profoundly disconnected from reality, living in his own deranged world where his mother's insane attachment superseded all human decency. Attorneys pursued an insanity plea, but the courts ultimately found him fit to stand trial, albeit clearly deeply disturbed. In 1958, Gein pled guilty to the 2 relatively minor charges of first-degree body snatching, following the discovery of cadaver robberies. Until his death in 1984 at age 77, Ed Gein remained institutionalized at Mendota, never speaking of his crimes publicly again after a few unsettling interviews. 5. Andre Chikatilo. So get this, Chikatilo, aka the Rostov Ripper or the Red-Headed Woodsman, no, like seriously, who cam EUP with these nicknames, had this oddly effective method of operation of luring people, often kids, under the guise of doing goofy magic tricks or helping with odd jobs. Just a friendly, unassuming stranger looking to entertain. But oh man, that warm facade melted away real quick once he got his prey isolated. This absolute psycho would suddenly snap into full slasher flick mode, strangling, beating, you name the crazy act. And believe it or not, that was just the warm-up. See, Chikatilo liked to get up close and personal with his victims in the sickest way possible, if you catch my utterly repulsive drift. Let's just say he was packing a real utensil for getting intimately twisted. For over a decade, this nutjob was allowed to roam free, snatching up innocent people left and right across Rostov. Didn't matter if you were a mailman, teacher, some poor kid. If Chikatilo locked those crazy eyes on you, you were as good as zipped up in a body bag. The really bone-chilling part was the fact that the guy had this whole unassuming, weirdo loner vibe that helped him actually blend in, while he collected his sickening trophies. Just another lonely, awkward loser drifting around with his bundle of shoes, musty trench coat, and other belongings, shall we say, shudders. After over a decade of crimes, the net finally closed in on the notorious Andre Chikatilo in 1990. Chikatilo's 1992 trial became a media circus in the newly opened Soviet society. Horrific details of his pathological lust for mutilation, cannibalism, and necrophilia with his victims' bodies emerged, captivating and revolting the nation. The defendant himself showed no remorse, even boasting about his accomplishments. On February 14, 1994, Chikatilo was blasphemously executed by shooting on Valentine's Day. According to witnesses, when asked for any last words, the unrepentant 57-year-old simply blew kisses at reporters witnessing his demise. 6. Pedro Alonso Lopez, ooh boy, let me tell you about this real piece of work named Pedro Alonso Lopez. Dude was absolutely off his rocker in the sickest way possible back in the 70s and 80s, over in Colombia and Peru. His whole demented modus operandi centered around preying on the most innocent and defenseless victims you could possibly imagine. Little girls, some as young as 7 or 8 years old, from impoverished villages and slums. Now here's where Lopez's MO gets real extra twisted and messed up. This fiend would actually integrate himself into these communities at first, playing the role of a humble street vendor or friendly handyman, just waltzing right into the lion's den, putting on his most disarming act to avoid arousing any suspicion whatsoever. But once he conned his way into gaining a child's trust through treats or bogus job offers, that's when the real nightmare fuel kicked in. His acts included severely beating the children, violently graping them, mutilating their bodies through means like crude disembowelment while they were still alive, intentionally disfiguring them, and ultimately killing them through means like strangulation or other gruesome methods. For years, this maniac stayed ahead of the law, bouncing relentlessly between villages while amassing an ungodly body count of reportedly over 300 murdered little ones. He was like a vapor, a bad smell you just couldn't get rid of, no matter how hard you tried to shake him. Even after finally being caught in 1980, Lopez was just utterly remorseless and soulless about the whole thing. Dude essentially bragged about his skills for disposing of all those poor bodies and methodically recounted his atrocities like he was reminiscing about a round of golf. As for his ultimate punishment, Lopez managed to avoid the death penalty in Ecuador initially by getting convicted on a technicality. So he essentially just got to kick back for a little under 20 years before getting released in 1998. Yeah, not even 2 decades for hundreds of depraved child murders. That's how tragically undercooked his sentence was. Thankfully, the universe seemed to course correct when an angry mob of locals got wind that this demon was once again free to walk the earth. They descended upon Lopez, beating and disfiguring him so severely that docs decided keeping him alive would be cruel and unusual punishment unto itself. So karma strikes once again.